Mr. Belliveau, could you state for the recording what war and branch of service you served in?
I served in World War II in the Army Air Force, starting out as an aviation cadet.
And what was your rank?
Well, when I started out, I was an aviation cadet, and towards the end of my combat period, I became a captain and retired as a captain in the Army Air Force Reserve.
And where did you serve?
I served overseas in the war zone. I served in England, flying over the continent of Europe.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted in December. I made an application for enlistment into the aviation cadet program of the Army Air Force in December of '41, shortly after Pearl Harbor.
Where were you living at the time?
I was living in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is a near suburb of Boston, Massachusetts.
Can you tell me your feelings at the time? What made you want to enlist?
Well, I had always had an emotional response to military matters, starting way back in the early 30s when the Japanese were invading China. I was always interested in reading about that in the newspapers and the horrific pictures of the Chinese people being shot and so forth. And then, of course, after Hitler and Mussolini became dominant in Europe and started to invade countries in Europe as well as Africa, I became more fascinated. And then when I heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had occurred, I knew I was going to have to enlist. I graduated from high school in 1939, but I couldn't afford to go to college, so I worked and went to night school in Boston. And I was in my second year of night school when Pearl Harbor occurred, and without a college degree, I had to take a series of tests at the Aviation Cadet Recruiting Center in Boston. After a few weeks, I found out that I qualified, so in January of 1942, I was sworn into the Army Air Force Aviation Cadet Program in Boston.
And how old were you then? Did you say 20?
Yes, I think I was 20, yeah.
Tell me about your training experience.
Well, training experience was I got out of I hadn't really been out of the Boston area before, and I got on the train to go to my first assignment, which was Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama, the headquarters of the Southeast Training Command of the Air Force. And I knew that, of course, being in Alabama, it must be very hot. So in January of 42, I got on the train, gave my winter coat to my parents who saw me off, and got to Montgomery, Alabama at Maxwell Field and froze to death. They had not anywhere near completed all the physical facilities, housing and so forth, that you need to support an aviation cadet program, which is really built on the West Point system. So we slept in tents in muddy fields, and it was just really miserable in terms of living conditions. But we had classes in all the subjects you'd expect: meteorology, aeronautics, navigation, mathematics, aircraft identification, a whole list of applicable subjects. And that program lasted for roughly 3 months, after which I was certified to go ahead into a bona fide flight program. And I left Maxwell Field, Alabama, in early summer of, I guess it must have been about May of 1942, and was sent for my primary flight training to Ocala, Florida. I'd never been in a plane before, and the custom was for the instructor, who were civilian instructors, to, as they say, ring out the new applicants for flight training. And so I was rung out and got deathly sick in the plane, and along with many other aviation cadets who were up for the first time, I had to swab out the cockpit.
What exactly is wrung out?
Well, you take the plane up and you do all kinds of maneuvers, loops and split rolls and all kinds of stuff like that. Wow. And I was there in Ocala, Florida for 3 months, and then went on to Greenville, Mississippi for my basic flying training, where I had a more powerful plane to fly. And all of these planes had the accommodation for the instructor to be in back and the trainee in front. And then after 3 months in Greenville, Mississippi, where, by the way, the ladies there couldn't believe, I looked awfully young for my age, and they were always invited us, aviation cadets, to parties with the young ladies in the place they call Greenville, Mississippi, the Queen City of the South. Anyway, I finished there, went to Dothan, Alabama for my advanced flight training, and graduated from advanced flight training after having gunnery training and formation training, again in what they call an AT-6, North American airplane, which was more powerful than the others. And got my wings in November of 42. I was in the class of 42K, and shortly thereafter I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Force Reserve. They called it the Army Air Corps Reserve. And I was designated after an evaluation of my flight training to become a fighter pilot. Some of the graduates had to go to multi-engine training to be bomber pilots. So I was sent to Florida, first of all to Tallahassee, Florida, where I did just a little bit of training, mostly education about fighter pilot training, and met the city manager's daughter and had a good time at parties with her. And then we went down to a godforsaken place called Cross City, Florida. It was just off the main highway between Tallahassee and Tampa, about halfway along, and it was a desolate area. And there I had my first exposure to fighter planes. And the first fighter plane that we were given to fly, the only ones they had there at the time, were Bell Air Cobra P-39s. It was the most beautiful airplane ever designed. And I got my training. I was scared to death because it was, I'd never, and training in the Bell Air Cobra did not, you had to go up by yourself and no instructor with you.
Was that the first time you'd been by yourself in the plane?
Oh no, we had, I had a lot of solo flights, but in each other plane that I was introduced to, I was introduced by a trainer who went up with me until I became familiar with the airplane. But that was not true with the Bell, with the P-39, and finally, after trying it out on the ground, just taxiing around, I had to take off, and as I said before, I was scared to death. It made so much noise. It was a unique design airplane. The engine was underneath the center, underneath the cockpit, and that was to allow the mechanism of the design to accommodate a 37 millimeter cannon, which shot through the nose, which was a tremendous piece of armament for an airplane. When we went gunnery practice in that airplane and shot that cannon, you could feel the jolt backwards. What do you call it when you jolted backwards? But anyway, and you could puff of smoke would come into the cockpit. The airplane was very unstable, even though it was beautiful. It had a very poor combat record in the South Pacific and in North Africa, where I'd seen some limited combat duty. And it was dangerous in the sense that it would get into a flat spin, and sometimes pilots couldn't get out of that. And pilots didn't like it, particularly for that reason. Shortly, about a couple of months after we arrived at Cross City, Florida, the first P47 Thunderbolts came off the production line from Republic's manufacturing facility in Farmingdale, Long Island. It was called the P47 Thunderbolt. And they sent a whole pack of engineers down with the first delivery of planes to help deal with unforeseen problems, of which there were many. The most serious of which was that a fighter plane has to be in all attitudes, and when the plane was in an upside down position, it would tend to lose oil pressure, and after enough exposure to that kind of flying condition, the engine would freeze up. So obviously that was a serious thing, and the engineers from Republic found a way to correct that problem. And we continued our training there until March of 1943, and we got orders to go overseas. And we didn't know where we were going. We got on a train. There was a great deal of secrecy connected with the movement of troops at that time. Moving lips sink ships was a slogan then. And so getting on the train, actually we got on the bus to Tallahassee and took the train up. We were going to Brooklyn, New York as a point of embarkation. And they changed our orders as the train was halfway up towards New York, and our orders were changed to go to Camp Kilmer in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And there we were issued overseas equipment, which included machete knives, mosquito nettings, fishing gear to fish for ourselves in the jungle if we had to survive. And we were loaded down with all this equipment. We thought sure we were going to the South Pacific. And anyway, one day after practicing getting on the train and off and finding out that it was an abortive attempt, we finally, the train finally went on its way. We didn't know where we were going. We ended up with French-speaking signs. We knew we must be in Canada. And sure enough, we went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and there awaited the arrival of, awaited the boarding of a passenger ship which was made up of all different types of troops, some from New Zealand, some from Australia, some from Canada, different groups from different parts of the United States, and there was a small Air Force contingent. I think there were about 20 of us, if I remember right, that went over together, that had finished our 47 training. So we got on this ship, and the boat, there was a French liner that had been commandeered by the Canadian people after Hitler invaded France, and although much of the shipping across the Atlantic at that time of year was in convoys, protected by submarines, etc., and protecting one another. We were a single ship that went over, and we zigzagged every few minutes all the way across the North Atlantic, and the weather was absolutely horrible. The North Atlantic in March is a terrible time, and we all got deathly ill, seasick. I shouldn't say all, but a great deal of us did. It took us 7 days to cross. We got to Liverpool, England. We didn't know where we were going to land, but shortly before we got there, we learned it was going to be Liverpool. The British met us at the docks with their lorries, what they called trucks, what we call trucks, and we were hauled to a train station, and ended up outside of Shrewsbury at an American training base called Atcham, not too far from the Welsh border. And there we awaited. The P-47s hadn't yet arrived over there, so we practiced flying in some beat-up airplanes left over from the Battle of Britain, Spitfires and other things like that, just for a short time. And then the P-47s came, and we practiced combat flying tactics over there.
Was it a big adjustment from the Spitfire to the P-47?
Oh yes, they were completely different types of airplanes. The P-47 was the heaviest fighter plane made. It had a wide landing gear, and had the attitude was such that in order to see in front of you when you were taxiing, you had to keep looking right and left. The Spitfire had a very narrow landing gear. Of course, its primary feature was that it was very maneuverable, and it could make tight turns as it did, and it was of course responsible for the British winning the Battle of Britain. But we went for our gunnery practice, we went to the Welsh coast at a place called Lambeter, and they had tow planes carrying hauling targets on the end of a long cable, a sleeve like a weather sleeve, and we practiced aiming at this target. We each had one of our own, and we were graded on the number of hits we got on that from different attitudes, coming in at certain angles and so forth. It's very difficult to aim compared to the modern aircraft that are all electronically controlled. All we had was a gun sight with a dot in the middle, and you just had to learn how to do that, like you probably learn if you ever shot a shotgun. You have to lead and so forth. We had to learn how that gun sight worked. Well, after we were there for a little while, we were sent to fill out this first squadron, that group of airplanes that P-47s had arrived, and in the combat unit, which was the 78th Fighter Group and 84th Fighter Squadron at Duxford, which is about 8 miles south of Cambridge. There were 3 fighter groups, the 78th, which I was sent to, and the 56th, which was the most famous one, and that was led at one time by Colonel Zemke and Colonel Gabreski, and Colonel Gabreski was the fighter pilot that shot down more planes than anybody else, any American in Europe. He had 28 kills. He just died early in 2002. So we got settled into our planes, and the first orientation flights that we had over enemy territory were what we call fighter sweeps. We just wanted to become accustomed to what it was to engage German fighter planes. And I remember a message that came over the radio from Lord Haw Haw, which was like Tokyo Rose in the Pacific, a British man that that went over to the German side. He was a fascist. And he said, "You better watch out for Hermann Goering's Yellow-Nosed Squadron. If you come over here, they're going to get you." It's comments of that type. And so we did have some fighter-to-fighter engagements, mostly just over the coast in Holland and Belgium and places like that. And then the bombers started to come over in large numbers, and our main job initially was to escort the bombers to their targets. And at first we had limited range. We couldn't escort a bomber all the way to Germany. But then the Republic and the Air Corps engineers devised a way of adding disposable gas tanks to the underneath of the plane to add to your fuel capacity. And they were different sizes and different designs. Some would carry an extra 75 gallons, some would carry another 150 gallons. So that enabled us to, with those tanks, to escort the bombers well into Germany. When we ran out of gas, we started out using the gas from the so-called auxiliary tanks, and then we pulled the trigger mechanism and dropped them. They were dropped, of course, all over the countries that we happened to be flying over. And the Air Force Command singled out Emden, Germany, where there was a very active submarine base, as the first target in Germany. It surprised the Germans because they were not aware of our capability in going that far. But they sent up many Me-109s, some 190s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and we were no sooner over the target area than I was a wingman for I think he was called Captain Stump at the time, and he was a veteran, a fair amount older than I was. And we were bounced by, or in other words, attacked by Me-109s, which were a very good high altitude plane coming out of the sun, and I went through some maneuvers I never went through in my whole life, because my job was to stay with him and protect him. And he did get many hits on an Me-109. We never on that particular mission, we never did get confirmation that the plane went into the ground, because there was just so much action going on. And in the meantime, we both got shot up. I got shot up the most. So we were quite disabled, and we had to break ranks with the rest of the squadron and sort of just edge our way back to the English coast, the northern part of England, where we landed at an RAF base. And we stayed there until they patched up the plane sufficiently for us to take it from there back to our home base at Duxford. Well, anyway, our activity involved a lot of missions of various types. The bombers, both B-17s, which were the most effective, and B24s, which at the end of the war there were more B24s than B-17s. But anyway, they would take off on surrounding airfields that were designated for bomber use. And while still in bed in the morning, we could hear the bombers getting up and trying to group. They would group in boxes, maybe 25 to a box, and they'd have many boxes. On a major mission, you could look on a clear day. You could look from one point in the horizon to 180 degrees to the rear, and you could see nothing but long lines of bombers. And it was a very magnificent sight, but of course a horrible one too, because these bomber pilots had to fly over areas that were heavily protected with anti-aircraft carrier, particularly over the industrial Ruhr Valley near Essen and other places, Cologne. And those guys would fly right into that flak, wouldn't deviate. Our job was to zigzag over them and try to protect them from any attacks by ME-109s or 190s. And then if the mission was deep enough, after we came near exhausting our fuel supply, another group would come in and take over from our point and take them in further towards the target. So it had to be a highly coordinated activity in order to get the fighters and the bombers and the different fighter groups all coordinated in the bomber groups so that they were all in line with the target. So I did that for, let's see, mostly up through the end of 1943. And then the beginning of 1944, the plans to invade Europe were being developed, and eventually, of course, it was decided that it would be Normandy, France, the point of invasion. So early in 44, England and the American forces were assembling all their equipment, tanks and the landing craft that were to take them across the channel and at various ports along the southeastern coast of England, and we could see the build-up there, and I often wondered why the Germans didn't make a greater effort to bomb all that, bring their bombers over and try and hit a lot of that stuff before it got started. But every now and then they'd have a mission, but they seemed to be more interested in bombing the cities like London and so forth. But I got involved beginning in 44 with a lot of dive bombing activity to take out bridges. We could carry either two 500-pound bombs, which is what we generally carried, in addition to an auxiliary gas tank underneath the middle, or in some cases a 1,000-pound bomb. But we couldn't take that very far. And the bombs had 7 to 11 second delayed action fuses in them, so that when you went into a bridge abutment, you went in as low as you could, and you let the bomb fly and skip into the abutment, and then you'd take off, and 7 seconds later, the way it was designed, the bomb would go off, and you would presumably be far enough away so that the bomb wouldn't send shrapnel into your plane. But in any event, on one occasion, one of my bombs would not release. So on the way back, I was jiggling the airplane around, trying to shake it loose, and couldn't do it. He had a group of 4 planes, and I was leading these 4 planes. And so one of my wingmen came in, and he tried to nudge the bomb off, and he couldn't do it. Of course, he didn't want to hit it too hard. So I had to come in. I radioed that I was coming into the land with one bomb that was supposed to have been released and hadn't released. So that made everybody on the ground at our air base very edgy. So all my buddies landed first, and I circled the field, and then they finally said, "Okay, you can come in now." And they had the ambulances lined up and everything, and I came in, and I no sooner my wheels no sooner bounced off the turf from the field than the bomb fell off. But it didn't explode. And I guess there was just not enough impact being that close to the ground. So I went taxied down to the end of the field. They said, let's all get out of here. So they deserted the field and called upon the RAF at a base that was just a few miles away. They had the experts on de-arming bombs. They had all this experience of bombs that they had to do negotiate in London that were dropped by the Germans and hadn't exploded. So they sent out a crew the next morning and managed to defuse the bomb and haul it away. So we went along, and as D-Day approached, we did more and more. In addition to bomber escort, we did more and more strafing of trains, anything that would move, trucks, bridges, as I mentioned, airfields. Tried to strafe their planes on the airfields. So I mentioned Peter Pompetti, one of our flyers, broke formation one time when he wasn't supposed to, and went down and shot up an airplane, and a German airplane, which he destroyed on the ground. But we tried to run a disciplined organization, and you weren't supposed to break ranks or formation without being released by the colonel who was leading the mission, or whoever was leading the mission. But anyway, he was a daredevil type of guy, and nothing happened to him except that he got shot down a couple of months later. He was due to his daredevil tactics, although he did shoot down several German fighter planes. Well, then, coming up to D-Day, one evening in June, we were called out of our beds to attend a special briefing. We weren't sure what it was all about, but at the briefing we heard that D-Day had arrived, and the next morning the troops would be taken off to land at Normandy. That very night, the British specialized in night flying activities, and their bombers were already in the air while we were being briefed. They were going over to the coast of France. Anyway, we were told that we were awakened at 4:30 to start our mission, and we were given our altitude. It happened to be 13,000 feet, high enough to be above the clouds, and yet to spot any German air activity that might be coming in to contest the landing of our landing craft. Well, the weather was absolutely horrible that morning. I was leading one of the squadrons, and we took off, and we were all supposed to be 16 together, flights, 4 flights of 4 each. That's the term I was trying to remember before. Flight was 4 airplanes. And the clouds were so low that we lost one another right after we get off the field. It was just my 4 planes together. The other flights, we just didn't see them again until we got back home. But we had to go through the solid cloud cover, and we broke out at 13,000 feet going across the channel, and meanwhile, and this was a maximum effort. You know, there were literally well over 1,000 American fighter planes going over, and coming back with the British coming through the same cloud cover. So you can imagine wondering what was going to happen in all those clouds where you couldn't see anything. But anyway, we did not see any enemy Luftwaffe airplanes, so I finally spotted a colonel was by himself with his flight too. He had lost his other flights, so we joined up together, and he said, "There's nothing up here, let's go down." So we went down below the clouds and found some trains and trucks to shoot up. and came back. And that was about a 4-hour mission. Then a little while later, the same day, we went over and repeated the same thing. So I had a little over 8 hours in the air on D-Day. After D-Day, the 8th Fighter Command that I was a part of resumed its main job of escorting bombers, while another group which had just been formed specifically for ground support work in Germany were setting up bases as quickly as they could across the channel. So the bombers were out, the heavy bombers were going out, and I went out escorting a few more missions. Then one day, coming back, it was a very clear day, and I was up about 30,000 feet coming back from an escort mission, and we didn't see any flak or anything. Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, there was a huge explosion and right underneath my airplane, and it threw shrapnel into the engine and blew the canopy off my airplane. And I didn't bring it with me, but I have some of the flak that I picked out of the headpiece behind my head. Anyway, that kind of was a jolting development. This was my 4th series of extra missions that I had volunteered for. I had what word am I looking for? A commitment usually for fighter pilots was a maximum of 200 hours, but this I had already exceeded 275 hours. And
roughly how many missions would you be required to fly, or was it just in hours?
It was for fighter planes. It was in hours. For bombers, it was in missions. Their I can't think of the name of the word. Their tour duty, combat duty, was 25 missions.
I see.
But of course, they were more like sitting ducks compared to the fighter planes, because we frequently flew well above them, and the flak was much less likely to catch us than it was. But of course, I did get caught this time. And I just flew, I can't remember how many more, but I decided that I was not going to volunteer for any more, so I ended up with about 302 combat hours. And my flight records, of which I have many here, show that I had 94 missions. But I had kept my own count, and my count showed 96 missions. And there's a dispute. I should say there's a dispute. Officially, I had 94, but by my count, I went on 96. A couple of times, I had to come back early. They call it aborting because of mechanical problems with my plane, and maybe I counted those as a mission because I was across the channel, and maybe whoever that was keeping the records didn't. So there's that discrepancy of 94 versus 96. But anyway, having done that, they sent me back to Atcham, where I had first trained in England near Shrewsbury, to train some replacements for the people. A lot of them were being shot down during the. We lost 13 men in our group over a period of about 3 days during the invasion period. And overall, the 78th Fighter Group was in action for 2 years, and they lost a little over 200 men.
Out of how many?
Well, let's see. I can't remember the number, but each squadron would have. We'd all fly 16 airplanes, but we had more pilots than airplanes, and I would guess that we had close to 30 pilots in each squadron, so that it would be 90 pilots. But of course, there was a rotation scheme in that, so that some people would finish up. They wouldn't volunteer for extra. Some got shot down, and so there were replacements continuously coming in. And I trained replacement pilots at Atcham until October of 44. Then I had orders to go back to the United States, and the notion there that I was going to train pilots in the latest P47s for those who would be sent to the Pacific to anticipate an invasion of Japan. So I had a couple of assignments at Hillsgrove Army Air Force Base in Providence before they got the Air Force took over the municipal airport in Norfolk, Virginia, to train these P-47 pilots. And when they were ready, I went down there and I trained them for not very long, 2-3 months, until VE Day, the end of the European War. Of course, the Air Force was just a minuscule group of people at Norfolk. There was a sea of white caps everywhere with the Navy. But I do remember the Navy pilots doing their training and how scared they were at training to land on a carrier at night. At that time, of course, they just had these flags, showing them and telling them whether they were too high or too low, and the ship was going up and down. It was a very difficult thing, and they dreaded it. I got all that story from talking with the Navy guys. So I had enough points. There was a point system developed, and I had more than enough points. Almost 4 years, the 3.5 years in the Air Corps, and with my combat hours and so forth, I was one of the first ones to be eligible for dismissal. That's not the right term.
Can you tell me what your most memorable experience was during your time in the service?
Well, D-Day, of course, was a very memorable occasion. Although for me specifically, I didn't get involved in any particular kind of dangerous activity. Certainly compared to everybody else that was involved, the ground forces or the naval people that were involved in the invasion. Well, I tell you, one time, I think this was in the this was at Christmas time, 1943. We had a celebration at our base, and of course, as I remember it, war activity was agreed to. There wouldn't be any on Christmas Day. But we had several airplanes that had been in maintenance, and they go so many hours and they have to be maintained, and all the pilots were living it up this one night, and the next morning the engineering officer who was responsible for keeping the planes in flying condition said, I've got this plane, I've got to get it certified for 40,000 feet flight. Would you be willing to take it up and test it out for me? So I happened to be in reasonably good condition that morning. So I agreed to do it, and I went up without doing much checking of weather or anything like that. It didn't look bad. And with a P-47 at that time, it took a long time to get up to 40,000 feet. And my design was to take a southerly route down to the southern part of England, and then to come back, and there was cloud cover, to come back and let down through the 180-degree turn, let down through the clouds, anticipating that I'd be in the Midlands of England, where there weren't very many hills and so forth. But I got caught in some high-altitude winds, jet stream, so to speak, without realizing it. And I must have been down almost over the coast of France, across the Channel. Didn't realize it. And when I finally did let down, instead of being over the Midlands of England, I was letting down in the London area. First of all, I should explain that my radio went out, so I couldn't get any help from on a vector or from the people that could help me with radar. So I noticed as I let down through the clouds, it was getting dark and foggy, and the visibility was terrible. And I noticed these, you heard of the barrage balloons they had over London. I was whizzing by barrage balloons, and I knew I had to get down right away. And I saw some activity that I thought, through the foggy conditions, that I thought was an airport. So I circled, and the people there on the ground there heard me, and they turned on the lights. Normally they wouldn't have done that. So I circled. I tried to get in a couple of times with the lousy visibility. I wasn't able to, but the third time I just went in anyway, and I missed the runway, and fortunately nothing bad happened. But I did end up as a raunchy, unshaven American pilot in the midst of this RAF squadron. And they were just getting ready to celebrate their, have a Christmas dinner. And, you know, the British do this in a very formal manner. The head, I don't know what it was, what they call him, but the group leader or what have you, was a mustached guy, and they were having their drinks before dinner, and then he asked me to, here I am in an old beat up flying suit, asked me to join him for dinner. So I sat at the table next to the base commander, and we went through all these rituals about, you know, here's to the Queen and this, that, and the other thing. So that was kind of a memorable. Actually, I didn't get out of there for about 2 or 3 days because we were just socked in. The weather was so bad, and without a decent radio, I didn't want to take a chance. But finally, the weather cleared up, and I was able to get back to my base. So that was kind of a memorable occasion. Didn't have anything to do with combat.
No, but sounds like fun. I'm curious about this. You had 94, 96 missions. Was your first mission different from, say, your 85th or your 94th? Did you become inured to it by that point? Well,
it took a little phasing in to get over the jitters. And there were jitters, especially at my first mission, as I said, in Germany. I got shot up. On several occasions, I got shot and had to come back and land at an English base right on the coast. But after a while, it became sort of routine. We knew exactly what to expect. And, you know, when you get into a war situation, you have friends that go down, but it's expected, and there's no mourning period. I mean, when somebody doesn't come back, you know, there's no getting together, there's no memorial service. At least I never experienced one. And that's why later on you'd choke up, because you never had time to get rid of all that grief. I lost 5 close roommates over that period, and including my squadron commander. And but for the most part, it was routine until that piece of flak hit me in blew the canopy off my plane, I knew right then that I didn't have much left, so I better get out of there, which I did.
What did you miss most during your time in the service?
Well, good food was one of them, although our pilots were pampered to death compared to the people on the ground. We call them ground pounders. Anybody who didn't fly was a ground pounder. And it really it went to ridiculous extremes. For example, when I first started to fly, the flight surgeon, after we come back from a mission, would have a bottle of bourbon there, and you could have drinks right then. Then after a while, he decided that wasn't a very good idea. So instead of doing that, what we do was have a ration of bourbon that we could drink any time we wanted. And then they would give. We had certain privileges compared to other people in terms of food. They'd actually give us eggs, and we keep them in our room. And then when we wanted, we'd take them down to the kitchen in the morning for breakfast, and they'd make us eggs, and all these other guys would. They had these, at that time, there were synthetic eggs. They tasted horrible. And of course, the butter was, I mean, what we call it, axle grease. That was pretty bad. But I was lucky. We had, as I told you before, we had excellent living conditions in this particular building that I was in. I mean, it was a solid building. It had a beautiful, large room with a bar in it and pool table, and we'd go in there in the evening, and I learned how to play bridge there, also poker, lost a little money playing poker. But those are some of the memories I have, mostly good memories. The thing that, one of the reasons I get so choked up is I've seen so many evidences of bravery on the part of people, particularly guys like your dad who flew bombers, and they'd go through, you know, a black wall. The planes wouldn't deviate 1 degree. They'd all go through, and every once in a while you'd see one get hit and they'd drop out, and another one. Those were kind of shocking things to see.
Do you remember when you heard that your service was over?
Yeah. No, I don't remember a particular event, although I participated in the celebration at Norfolk where I was when VE Day was announced. You know, just everybody going out and having a big time, probably drank too much. But right away I knew I was eligible to get out because the point list, the Army was prepared. I guess they anticipated this. And see, I was a part of the Army. The Air Force didn't become a separate unit until sometime later. I forget when. Later in the 40s. They're always a part of the Army. But I do remember when I got back into civilian life, the adaptation for me to go from service life in the military back to civilian life was much tougher than going from being a civilian into the military. I mean, I could take on, you know, you have to stand at attention to eat square meals and all this crazy stuff that you go through as a cadet, for example, and all the stuff, you know, hurry up and wait in the military. I coped with that all right. I sort of anticipated that that's the way it would be. But when I got back home, I felt lost. It's a big change in lifestyle, tremendous. And the way people would worry about little things that didn't seem to mean anything. You know, why are they worried about? They were worried about silk stockings, and and whether they had a ration card for this or a ration card for that. And the war was still going on in the Pacific. You know, VJ Day didn't occur until August. And I was, my final leave actually expired in early July of 45. And I immediately applied for admission to Yale on the GI Bill. I had been married just the year before. No, wait a minute. No, I hadn't been married. I applied for admission to Yale, and I got in. And I was very proud of that. And but of course, here I was, a guy who'd been through combat, and these young 17-year-old kids were coming in as freshmen. You know, there was too big a gap between the younger people and those of us. So we tended to, not completely, but we tended to, the veterans were sort of, did things together.
That's probably natural.
Yeah, yeah.
What is the most important thing, the single most important thing you think you learned from your experience?
Well, one thing is teamwork. They drummed that into us. You flew in formation, and you obeyed orders, and you stuck together as a team, protected one another. And I think that's still true today in the military. I think that's the most. Of course, I was exposed to British living, which had a long-term effect on me. I admire the British very much.
Have you gone back?
Yes, I've been back 3 or 4 times. And I always felt a special relationship with the Welsh people, because when we did our gunnery training in Wales, and they were very, very welcoming to us. And they were, of course, we were the first ones over, so we were a little bit of a novelty. That may have worn off after the Americans were there for a long time. But I remember getting on a train once, taking a leave for a few days. I think I was going to Edinburgh, Scotland. And no, I was going to Prestwick in Scotland. And I got off the train, and this Englishman who, you know how they have these, you sit opposite one another in these, I don't know what you call them, booths or what. And they were on strict rations for meat, particularly. And this British guy who hadn't said a word to me, we were each reading all the way from, you know, maybe an hour and a half's trip or something like that on the train. And finally he blurted out something as we got off the train. He says, "Do you have anything to do this evening?" He says, "Would you like to come and have dinner with us, me and my family, my wife?" And I said, "I'd love to." So he invited me to his home, and they must have used up a whole month's worth of rations just to feed me that night. They were so great.
It's wonderful. What do you feel personally was your greatest achievement during your time in the service? Your own personal achievement?
Well, my own personal achievement was that I became a good flyer, and especially at aerobatics. And that's what although I wasn't the best by any means, but I got excellent ratings in it whenever I was rated. And I was able to handle combat conditions without breaking up over it. Some guys went psycho as a result of being in combat. But I was as calm as anybody during combat operations. And I think that was quite an achievement in view of what we were facing. And that doesn't mean I wasn't emotional, but most of my emotions have developed much later in life.
Is there anything that you would like to add for the record that we didn't cover during the interview?
No, I agree with the statement of Franklin Roosevelt that war is hell. He said, I hate war. And war is just chaos. Of course, we've seen a lot of chaos just in the small war we have in Iraq. Crazy accidents happen. Unforeseen things happened. Mistaken identity is a huge problem in war. Huge. British planes have been shot down by Americans. American Navy shot down paratroopers landing in Sicily. I almost got shot down by a P-51 over Europe because he was coming in from northern Italy and was not aware of my operations. He mistook me for a Focke-Wulf 190. So you see a lot of chaotic activity, and like even in sports, you know, the organization makes the least mistakes. You know, a lot of mistakes are going to be made. The one who makes the least mistakes comes out on top. That's one of the big lessons I've learned.
Mr. Belliveau, I want to thank you. It's been a privilege and an honor to be interviewing you. I want to thank you for your time.
Okay, fine. I was glad to do it. Thank you.